A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. As a young child, we experience the world directly through our senses. We discover that by changing and manipulating the physical world, we can satisfy our basic material needs and desires. Children attach primary importance to their physical senses because this is how they understand and interact with the physical world. For a child, something that they can experience with their physical senses they consider real, and things that they cannot see or touch or smell or feel or taste they call make-believe. The non-material or imaginary things are things that we want to exist and not things that we have determined actually exist. For most of human history, God was something that was made by human. And for many religions and in many places and times in the world, that essentially was true. Ancient societies created idols. The idols were an attempt to represent something that was non-physical, that was non-material, that they could all sense and understand in a very abstract way. However, they wanted to represent God in a way that made God like them or similar to themselves, so that they could understand, or what they thought could understand God better. They believed that sincere devotion to these idols or these man-made gods would allow them to connect with God and would bring them peace, happiness, joy, wealth, etc. Idol worship was not confined to the ancient world. Many people today worship idols by different names. Many times the idols are the illusion that happiness or peace comes from other material things and other people. If I just had more money, I could solve all my problems and be happy. Money is their idol. If I could just become famous, everyone would love me and I would be happy. So they make fame their idol. If this or that person would give me what I want, then I would be happy. And then they're making another person into an idol. Or if I could just get this specific job, position in society, etc., I would be happy. So they make a role or a position into an idol. The problem is that when we worship an idol, we're creating a false god. We're projecting our own humanity or our own self onto something else, and we're worshiping that, and we're doing it in a way, we're representing something in a way that's understandable to us normally in a physical sense. The problem is that this idol that we're creating, in reality, it's not real, although it's physically real, it has a physical reality, but it actually has no power either to help us or to harm us. In most cases, in most communities, what we see is that idol worship actually led to exploitation of people. It actually led to injustice. There's been many cases where societies in which were idol worshiping societies, those people that had or claimed some type of a special or unique relationship to the idol basically put themselves in charge of the process of worshiping that idol, and they used that position to exploit the community, to get additional privileges or to get money or power within the community, again, by claiming this special relationship. And of course, they were able to do this because the idol itself couldn't argue with them. The idol couldn't talk, it couldn't respond, it couldn't, it wasn't real. So the idol, of course, is not going to tell people, no, these people are just making it up, because the idol was just a piece of wood or stone or paper or whatever it is, and it didn't have any power to defend itself or to help them or help anybody else. The common factor among all prophets, legitimate prophets that were sent by God, that were sent by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether they're Christian, Jewish, Muslim, is that they called people towards the worship of the one true God. That was essentially the litmus test. They came to different people, different communities, different times, and their messages were different to some extent. The way that they prayed, the way that they fasted, the details of their Sharia or their Islamic law were different. However, the one thing that was common among all of them is that they called people towards the worship of the one true God. They told people, don't create false gods for yourself and worship them. Worship the one true God, the creator of all people, the only force that is worthy of being worshipped and is true. Skip a little bit further in history, starting about 600 years ago. the methodology or the form of idol worship began to change. So it changed from worshiping physical objects or deities, science worship, and materialism. So about 600 years ago, elite members of the Christian church in Europe basically began to challenge the authority of the church. So scientists and philosophers and thinkers began to challenge the political authority of the Catholic Church, and basically were the people that were calling for secularism or for government that doesn't depend for its authority on the church or on religion. The result of many of these challenges that took place during the European Renaissance resulted in the modern secular democratic governments that we see today, both in Europe and in the United States, and essentially all around the world. Essentially any government that has a republican form of democracy, that is secular, and that the laws are based on something other than religion. These basically come from these ideas that came out of the European Renaissance. And these countries, by the way, are also the most economically powerful countries in the world today. These types of secular democratic governments generally see a circumscribed role for religion in society. And basically what we mean by circumscribed role is that they don't see religion or belief in God as being the foundation or the basis of their society. They see religion as being something that's practiced privately in the home and in the church. However, the laws of the society and of the government and the functioning of the government are essentially based on the consensus of the people, or the idea that the people as a whole have the authority to decide what laws they want to be governed under and what form of society they're going to have, what the rules are, what the norms are, legally, politically, etc. Why is this a problem, and why is this part of this lecture or this discussion? The reason that it's part of the discussion is because what's essentially happened is the form of idol worship, of worshiping, like I said, physical deities, has moved from the worship of those physical deities to the worship of ideas that were created by man rather than physical structures. So the idea of democracy, the idea of secularism, the idea of Western empirical science. We don't mean science in general, because generally speaking, science includes rational and logical proofs. But the Western scientific methodology is strictly materialistic, or it requires material experimentation. The scientific method, quote unquote scientific method, which requires an experiment using physical objects in order to provide proof of something. And the worship of this process to be the only valid method of proving something. These ideas have become the idols of our time, where they're just ideas that were created by people, and they can be challenged and they can be changed. There's nothing sacred or there's nothing eternal about these ideas. However, whenever these ideas are challenged, people essentially invoke the idea of democracy or invoke the idea of secularism or empirical science as a proof in itself. Just invoking those terms or that methodology settles the issue. Why do we have to have a democratic republic? Why can't we have another form of government, for example, the United States or Europe? To say that itself is considered heresy, or is considered, it's not acceptable, an acceptable discourse, because you're basically showing that these idols are man-made, and they didn't come from anywhere other than the ideas of people, and people can challenge them and people can change them. They're worshiping those ideas that came out of the European Renaissance. The title of this work is Seeing is Believing, and the subject is Tawheed. And I know that was a very long introduction to the subject, and it wasn't really an introduction. It was more like a development of the subject, and basically how do we get to, or how do we understand this idea, seeing is believing. In other words, I won't believe in something unless I can physically see it, unless it has a physical reality, unless it's testable in some type of an empirical or scientific way. What they forget is that the most important way of determining what is real and unreal is not with the physical senses. Physical senses can easily be fooled. We've all seen optical illusions. We're all familiar with P.T. Barnum and circuses and magicians. So it's obvious that physically seeing something is not proof that it's real. Hearing something, of course, is not real, because, as we all know, the hearing and other senses can be fooled. If you took somebody from 300 years ago and you played this video to them, they would believe that, there was an actual man or person inside their computer talking to them. But obviously, since we understand digital technology, we know that that's, of course, not true. So all of the senses are dependent on the rational mind, the logical mind, to determine, to be the gatekeeper as to whether or not something is real or not, regardless of whether we have a physical sensation. The Quran constantly calling people to reflect and to think about their situation and to use reflection and to use logic and reason to come to a conclusion about something. One of the most famous or well-known examples of this, especially in regards to the subject of Tawheed, is the Prophet Ibrahim alayhi, who was the first one to call himself a Muslim. And he began with the physical evidence. He began with looking at the sky, looking at the star, looking at the moon, looking at the sun, and basically saying, these things are great, but slowly coming to the conclusion that these are not God. This is not the deity that's worthy of worship, because these things are limited. They rise and they set, and they become dim and they become brighter. These things are not eternal, and they're part of the physical world, therefore they can't be the creator of this physical world. So he used the process of rational thinking and reflection. Although he did use his senses, he used his eyes, he used other physical senses. What determined reality for him and what determined what was real and what was worthy of worship was his logical, rational thinking. There are many people today that say, if you can't show me something physically, if it doesn't have a physical form, then I don't believe in it. I don't believe that it exists. This method of thinking actually has always been around since the beginning of human history. There's never been a time when there haven't been a significant number of people that have thought this way, that have believed that only things that exist are the things that I can see and touch and feel and smell. That was a very common belief of the Arabs before the time of the Prophet Muhammad, which is commonly referred to as the Jahiliyyah. There's been many primitive societies that have also believe that, although not many, but there have been some, but they're not necessarily the people that you would want to emulate. And of course, it leads to hedonism. So if there's no existence beyond our physical world, then it would be logical for someone to say, then all I care about is avoiding pain and maximizing pleasure, which is the definition of hedonism. Somebody who doesn't live by any ethical or moral principles, they're simply living to increase the amount of pleasure they receive and avoid pain. Anyone who's attempted to live that way knows that that's not a very good way to live. In addition, many things that are experienced commonly by all people, and all people that agree that they exist, are non-material, and yet they're experienced. Everyone experiences love. Everyone has experienced a situation where someone acted courageously, where there was no material explanation, there was nothing that the person could gain in any type of material sense, and yet they were courageous. People have experienced mercy from others, they've experienced forgiveness from others. All of these things are ideas, but there is no physical component. These are ideas, these are principles, these are experiences that have no material corollary. So all people agree on the existence of non-material reality. But some people have a very circumscribed or limited view, the non-physical reality that we experience all the time. So to the subject of Tawheed, the primary argument that Muslims have for saying that God is one and that he cannot be represented in any type of a physical form is because anything that's physical has limits and it has boundaries. If it's physical, if it's material, then it has a limit somewhere, or it exists somewhere, and it doesn't exist somewhere else. Muslims believe that God is omniscient, that he's omnipotent, that he exists everywhere at all times and all places, and he's not limited by anything. There's nothing that limits his power, his authority, his perception of what's going on. If he sees and hears like us, but not through any type of physical instruments, but he is aware of all things that are going on without the need of tools or instruments or appendages or anything that we would need. An existence such as that requires no physical component, right? Because any physical component at all would be a boundary. we come to the question which is most commonly asked of Muslims. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not physical and He's unlimited and He can't be seen and He's everywhere but doesn't have any type of physical component, then how can one experience the reality of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Which is a very legitimate question. And it's something that a lot of both Muslims and non-Muslims struggle with from time to time, right? The more abstract you make something, the more difficult it is to understand the reality of that thing. And there's, of course, many, many, many methods or ways for Muslims to experience Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala without any type of a physical connection. For example, one of the purposes of the Sharia or the Islamic law is to perfect or purify the heart of the Muslim or the character of the Muslim. And this purification actually leads to one to experience reality in a much more comprehensive sense, in a much more broader way than someone experiences reality who's only focused on satisfying their physical needs and desires. So just simply by having that experience of purifying yourself through obeying the orders of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that by itself allows someone to experience the reality of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the forgiveness of God that envelops and surrounds us at all time. The Orphan teachers of Islam often describe this as what's called the polishing of the heart, that the heart is like a mirror, and that the more we try to purify and perfect our character, the more we reflect the nur, which is the light or the essence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in our own selves and our own behaviors. And many of us have been in contact with people or been around people that seemed almost to be holy or what I would say a purified or a very pure personality. And that person seems to almost glow or almost give off a physical reflection, which Muslims believe that is the nur of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in some ways, you're not, of course, experiencing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala directly, because you can't in any kind of a physical way. But just being around individuals like that, you understand much more about the reality of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than when you're not around those people. So that's one way that of experiencing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The other way, of course, as we alluded to, is through thought and reflection. So when a Muslim is in a quiet place and they contemplate their existence and the beauty and the intricacy of the creation that's all around them, and how everything in the universe fits together perfectly, and reflecting on that reality, they cannot help but come to the conclusion or know something about the Creator or the one who created this universe. So by studying and reflecting on the creation of God is another very powerful way for the Muslims, in a sense, to see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not directly, but to understand God through the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there's, of course, many other ways. When Imam Ali alayhi salam was asked, "Do you see your Lord?" his answer was, "How can I worship a God that I can't see?" The reply was, "Well, what do you mean by see? You mean see physically?" He said, "No." He said, "Of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cannot be seen. However, the heart, the qulub of the mu'mineen, of the believer, does experience the reality of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but not in a physical way. Nevertheless, they do experience Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala." And the experience, the word heart, when they say heart in Arabic, it has to be also clarified that in English, oftentimes, the heart is only associated with emotion, with love, caring, those things. In the Arabic language, however, and especially in Islamic literature, the heart is the integration of both emotion and feeling, and also rationality and logic. So it's in a sense, it's the connection between the heart and the mind. In a connection between the heart and the mind, the person does have the ability to perceive or to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to experience Allah, the reality of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the experience is something that not only it's not physical, but it goes far beyond the physical. And it's actually a much more real experience than even the physical reality is that we experience now. In this way, without creating idols, but by reflection and by thinking and by polishing our heart and by perfecting our own character, we can, in a sense, see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what we see or experience is something far beyond the physical reality that we experience on a daily basis. Assalamu alaikum.